Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Mindful Wealth Podcast. I have with me today Thom Shea, who is an ex-Navy SEAL who then later got into writing, and he wrote a book called Unbreakable, which I read as the lead up to this episode. And we're going to just have a conversation today with Thom about mindset and about some of his experiences as a SEAL. So, Thom, why don't you, by way of introduction, just tell us a little bit about yourself?
That's always the hardest question. I don't like him, talking about myself. It's the weirdest thing. But I think I do grace to it. I was in the SEAL teams for 23 years. I retired about 7.5 years ago. And I had spent a lot of time being in very harsh situations, both physically and mentally and spiritually, if you want to pull the whole gamut together. And I had written a book about those experiences to my kids in 2009 and my wife that it originally was titled Spartan Woman, because I wanted my kids to know that men don't really succeed well without an equally gifted hard woman. And that didn't make it past the editors. But it was a story about what it was like to lead men in combat and be a father and be gone and have a lot of emotions that you have to keep in check. And then that was kind of the genesis of Unbreakable and my retirement into the civilian community.
Well, first of all, as an American, thank you for your service,
Sure.
especially your service. I mean, you guys do the toughest stuff, so I appreciate that very much. So this is a podcast about the pursuit of wealth and success, or however we define those things. In Unbreakable, you give mindset lessons that can be applied to any walk of life, I assume. Could you summarize, or if that's too vast, give us your top 3 techniques that our audience can apply to their quest for their own success?
First lesson is the ability to make a promise and keep it. You think that's easy, but it's very difficult for people to do that. And so that was the second lesson that found itself really relevant in the real world. And the third lesson is the ability to not let emotions control you. And it's kind of throughout several different lessons after lesson 3. It's probably intertwined into all 13. So I've made now a business out of teaching people what emotions are for, especially at the leadership level. And because ego kills business quicker than any aspect. And so those 3 lessons of honor your word, endure through difficulty, and don't let emotions and ego control you. We could probably stop right there in business, and that would solve a lot of wealth issues for human beings.
Can I'm going to throw you a little curveball if you don't
Sure.
mind. Are you watching the Olympics?
Yes.
So can you comment on Simone Biles' decision to not continue? I mean, you know who that is?
Yeah, I do. I love, so now the answer will probably disturb you. I don't believe anything I see on TV.
Well, of course.
I'm not a fan of the thinking what you see is true. So literally humans cannot comment on Simone Biles. We're not there.
I love the stance of reserve judgment. Like, let's just let her deal with her decision and we don't have to comment. I love it.
Mm-hmm.
And I wish, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no. So I guess I also just wanted to pull on something like kind of from this comment about emotions, and maybe that thread's going to work its way into the rest of the conversation later on. And I guess in my own way, I've struggled with like some, how much do you let emotions interfere with your decision making? How much do you space do you give them? And I guess the conclusion that I came to with that is that emotions are a bit like the weather. You kind of can't stop them from being there, but you don't necessarily have to let them control the decisions you make. And I wonder if that's kind of the conclusion you came to, or if you approach emotional life in a different way. I get the sense that sometimes you argue to put it a bit more in a box than that. I don't know, maybe you can say a little bit about what you think.
Sadness literally leads to physical death. So if you remain sad over time, you're causing the physical outcome of your body to die. So it's a weird response. So sometimes our responses, since we don't we're not taught them in detail. Sadness is not a really great response to things. Somebody dies. Why is that sadness? Why isn't that joy? Emotions arrive at the same time with a problem, but your emotional response never uncovers the problem. So it's a weird, I put it into our training. It's actually a 6-hour block of training, and it's interesting to see how it fleshes out. The mind is a beautiful instrument that causes things to happen, and emotions are like a key. When you turn them on, they really rapidly cause what they're supposed to cause. And in the SEAL teams, you're kind of thrust into understanding them, because if you're in a bad situation and you emotionally respond to it, you're already dead. So what happens to people who are constantly facing difficult things is they don't emote in the middle of them. They emote later, because I've come to find out emotional responses are never effective. They rarely are. Like feeling passionate about a boyfriend or girlfriend, it lasts as long as the weather holds. And then it changes on Tuesday. And if you marry for passion, on Wednesday, you want a divorce. So it's weird how emotions are not really helpful over time. And if they're not controlled, they cause something to happen that you don't.
Okay. And so maybe we can sort of weave this together. So I noticed, in your book, you refer a lot to internal dialogue. And so maybe you could explain to us a little bit more what you mean by that. I know, for example, in Buddhism, there's a certain amount of talk about monkey mind, right?
Mhm.
Which is that your internal chatter is sort of always going on. And how might one navigate through that to have an internal dialogue that's productive? Because in my understanding of the mind, there's kind of this radio constantly chattering, and then you sort of select which thoughts you want to identify with. And is that kind of what you mean by internal dialogue, or do you mean something else?
Yeah, you said it more beautifully than I could have said it there. So what I look at is the truth of it is, be very careful when you use the words I am something or they are something, because you can destroy your team if you browbeat them with those being verbs. Like you are useless. That person can't overcome that. And so in the SEAL teams, you're never allowed to browbeat each other. You get it, and obviously you get browbeat in training, and then you shut that situation down where nobody can tell you who you are. And then in the teams, if you browbeat somebody else, they'll usually just beat you up. And because it's so demonstrative, you'll change the dynamic of war if the people that are collectively trying to fight it browbeat each other with that language. Like, hey, we're screwed. Get out, sit in the back of the truck. Because don't use language to predetermine this outcome, because you always feel like you're going to die. And you're very careful that you don't demonstratively say that, if you understand what I meant by that.
How do you, I mean, is there I mean, we have thoughts and we have words that come up in our heads that we don't, I do. I've meditated for 25 years and I still have thoughts that pop into my head that I don't control. And I go, oh, that's probably, so how do you, is there a practice that you can use to manage some of that?
The monkey mind is always there. If you want to use that analogy, it just becomes irrelevant the more you intentionally. So the practice that I teach is, it's a 10-minute section in the morning and at night, where you declare who you are using a formula it's a word formula that has who I am, what my goal is, what I need to accomplish, people in my life, how I'm going to accomplish it, and why. Those 6 statements you have to articulate morning and night, and that really calms down the arbitrary thoughts of we're screwed that always comes up for human beings, until you intentionally put it, because the only times that are relevant in morning and night. Like if you use those points as meditation, you create your day, then you create your night. So those periods of time, morning and night, are essential to reiterate and to intentionally create words for the mind to grasp.
You're sort of doing an override. Like there's some natural things you might think because you are tired, but then you do an override and say, these are the 6 things I'm going to actually focus on and say.
Because the brain believes what you tell it.
Yep.
So be very careful what you tell it.
In your book, you refer a lot to your relationship. And you mentioned earlier that you were going to name the book originally Spartan Wife, and that didn't fly. Now, I get the sense that your relationship is something you've worked on a lot, thought about a lot. If you wanted to give us some advice or some keys to that fulfilling marriage, what would you say?
I failed in my first one, so I
Me
unintentionally
too.
had to
Me
create
too.
another. I
Wow.
literally had to create another way to look at it because, man, I don't want to do that again. And so Stacy and I had to clean slate. She'd been married twice. I'm like, we're screwed. I mean, our past is just telling us this is doomed. And I had 2 kids, but I saw in her something that was admirable. And for a man to admire a woman, I think to me is rare. And I want more of that. So we had to sit down and create a language and a way to interact with each other that was not based on our past indiscretions. And so we came up with, it's a weird thing. And did you try it? And so a way to create a method to relate to another human being is somebody has to initiate the conversation, but the conversation is, I get to listen to her for 10 minutes a day. I have to turn off anything but listening to how powerful she is. But most men struggle with listening to how powerful their wives are. I just say that openly now. Once you can do that, you transform your relationship with the woman and she gets transformed. Most people can't do that. When you as a man or a woman can do that 30 minutes a day, you discover in each other something new pretty much every 15 days. Like, wow, I didn't know that. Well, that's cool because I get to be with her at the level that she changes, and turnover rate just falls off. Because when you get listened to, you're a transformed human being. I went deep on that, but sorry for going so far on that.
No, that resonated in a way that you couldn't possibly know because of I've discovered in myself in the last 2 months how I hide.
Mhm.
I will not share. But my brother died, so I needed help, and so I forced myself to go and say, "Listen, Kate, could you just sit with me for 10 minutes?" And she did, and she's fantastic, and we're closer now than we've ever been because of that vulnerability, because of that openness, because of just sitting face to face. So it just resonates what you're saying. It's fantastic.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
imagine
I
what
think
happened.
no,
Go ahead.
no, sorry, go ahead.
No, please, you.
No, so what I was going to say is I also think what's interesting is how you describe how that kind of tends to radiate out. Like if you're able to create one relationship like that, there is this kind of communication and not hiding and all that stuff, that it like sort of makes its way out into the other spheres of life. So I think that's interesting.
Well, so that becomes true. All humans are related. That's the truth. I don't like the word vulnerability because you don't have to be frail to do that. You don't have to have a problem to encounter to that you share. You share because it's creative. It creates access to something that you didn't already have. And I share with Stacy what's true for me. So that's what I value, and I have to share what I value. And I'm struggling trying to figure out the spiritual side of how people are connected to me. And I share that to her. I work with you because my life works. And in the teams, you didn't follow the leadership. You were there because your life was better for having been there. And they can't pay you to do it. It's a terrible environment to live in. But why you're there is because your brothers know you and you can share anything with them. And nobody says bad things. They may punch you in the face for being stupid, but you never are rejected from that community. And it's a deep level of love that you never experience anywhere else. And that's why you're able to function at a high level. And I think that should be taught to anybody.
Cool. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I wonder if we can just change gears, kind of to get at the theme of true wealth. So this is a podcast called Mindful Wealth. And one of the questions that always comes up is how do you, Thom, think about true wealth? What is that to you? Is it financial? Is it spiritual? How might you describe what it is to be truly wealthy?
I have two answers. So you have to value what you pursue, and you have to find compensation for it. Otherwise, it's a hobby and it doesn't follow under wealth. So that's one aspect of the answer. The other aspect of the answer is you have to pursue those 5 areas of life to have true wealth. Wealth, it's a 30-part formula, so a 30x formula. My true wealth formula that I call it, which is interesting. Physical pursuit, the pursuit of my health, gives me a 4x. The pursuit of wealth gives me a 5x. The pursuit of relationships that are on point gives me a 7x. And spiritual pursuit gives me a 13. So true wealth is the constant day-to-day pursuit of those 5 pyramids, I call them. And none of them outweigh the other. You have to do them non-negotiable every single day. And you can't just do one. And it's a visceral feeling when the people that go through the training feel that at the end of it. They're like, wow, I feel like I'm at a different place in life because of the value I put on all 5 areas, and you pursue them every day.
I love the equation. Like I'm all about, I love spreadsheets and how to, and just putting a weight on those different things, and how spirituality is at the top of that weight and relationships are just underneath that. And money is actually below both of those. I think that's fantastic. And I would completely agree with that. It's beautiful. How do you know you're one of the good guys? Like, how do you know that violence serves a purpose, a good purpose?
So that's the Pandora's box of definition. So I don't know if good is a reference to very difficult times. Hopefully you defined who you were before. As a SEAL and a father and a husband and all that shenanigans that happened prior to combat, my job was, I didn't care about the enemy. I had no emotional response to the enemy. My job was to get 22 men back home. Sometimes you don't get that choice. Your brain is turned on and it's questioning right and wrong, and it's just a moral high ground. And you see somebody, a guy rape a girl, and you're like, man, I don't know if I should shoot him. I don't know if who's right and wrong. You've already defined it before you go in there. So you're just acting on those critical points that you've made to yourself prior to going in, which is the advantage of being a SEAL, is you've worked this out prior to going into combat. The mind wants to connect to other humans. And in the moment, it has to disconnect to pull the trigger. Like, it has to look at that other human as nothing. It's the only way that it can function. And you have to learn to turn it off and on. It's a terrible thing to say openly in front of somebody, but if you don't survive. And you got to learn to reprogram that when you're back into the real world.
Mm-hmm. I don't know what I was expecting as an answer to that question, but I guess like something sort of like that, because I think there's one aspect maybe that's situational of like, what do you do to survive when you find yourself in that situation? And like, absolutely, the time that you spend thinking about stuff is time that you're taking away from your reactions. And when every 15 seconds matters, you can't be mulling over a moral dilemma in your mind. Like, I get that. I suppose my question of what I wanted to ask is that, when you pull the plug sort of on the moral compass, if we want to put it that way, at what point, like, being an American, I'm actually in Canada, I'm Canadian. At what point does your orientation in that make sense? Because let's say the guys on the other side presumably also have families, presumably also have a kind of a history. They're also fighting for something that I guess they believe in. So how, or do you take apart the ethics of that and say, how do I end up in this armed conflict? And how do I know that I'm on like the right side of that?
There's always going to be violence. There's never going to be peace. There's never peace. I don't have an answer for what's right and wrong. I appreciate the fact that there are humans over there that have lived there in the mountains for thousands of years. They hadn't seen white people. We were the first white people they'd seen. I was like, wow, it's cool. And Then there was some bad things that you witnessed. So there was always the turn on and off switch that you had to have. And I don't have an answer to the right and wrong. I just operationally, when the SEAL platoon gets feet on the ground, they're no longer worried about it. That discussion happened before. And then when they come back, they have to be able to process what they did with their family.
I wonder if part of the establishing, it's not the rightness, but it's your connection to your family, your nation, your SEAL team that sort of establishes, hey, we're moving forward. And it's a choice between that guy facing you and you. So many other guests also speak of this connection as a source of meaning. It's my sense that focusing on certain types of connectedness fosters peace, understanding, and other types, placing ethnic, religious, national, clan identities fosters conflict. So can you comment on
wow, that's
where
awesome.
those connections, derive?
Oh man, that I think is the best phrased question about humanity. Uh, uh, what I said earlier is there's no distinct difference between any human and another human. You may look differently. My kids are from me and they look different. They're not different. To me, they are one with me. They're a part of me forever because I hold that distinction inside. And that internal distinction should actually be taught. And the only separation that can be that can be had is if I distinguish you as different than me. The only reason people in combat function well together is they're there for their buddy. Country never shows up in combat. Like I didn't give a shit that I was a United States citizen. They weren't there. And so that connectivity arises from inside, and you're the one responsible for that level of human interaction, and it happens inside. If I don't like you, that's my problem. That's not because you're black or green or purple. It's not because you did something wrong. It's because I defined who you are and what you look like as something that I don't appreciate. That's my problem. It's not a societal issue. It's my problem. All that happens internally. And that is the truth about human beings, is there's no distinct difference between anybody other than what we say internally about that other person. And it's up to us and nobody else. And that will resolve all this. So sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but I find that so fascinating, like coming from somebody who's, pulled the trigger on people, because on the one hand, it's like you're acknowledging like the ultimate connectedness of everybody. And on the other hand, at times you're able to switch it off. I mean, I find that paradox like just really interesting.
Yeah, so does my wife. So you're in good company. But I wish I could articulate it better. The combat was simple to me. It was black and white. It's the only time in life there's just black and white. There's no grayness, none. You either survived or you did not. There's difficulty, but there's no grayness in decision making. And that's why, if you've ever heard why people go back to combat, because it's the only time in life where shit makes sense. Like it's so clear. And it's just a dangerous place to be. I find it fundamentally lack of, it's not exhausting at all to be in a combat situation. There's only time in life where everything was perfect. It was beautiful. To me, it was peace, which is the weirdest paradox ever.
Yeah, I don't even know where to go with that.
Yeah, I'm sorry
I brought that up.
Just seems so paradoxical.
Yeah, does seem paradoxical. But
the acknowledgement of where you are.
But to Thom, I want to just thank you for being willing to be so honest with us about this stuff, because like I was, as I was putting these questions together, I was like, wow, like, okay, I'm really going to ask him this stuff. And like, I'm really enjoying the conversation because I feel like there's like just a level of honesty there that's like really good. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. Appreciate it.
And so I guess I wanted to kind of like poke at something else, with, human history. Like if you look at the statistics of, violence, and, you kind of say you think that violence is always going to be there and you'd rather not be on the receiving end of it. I think if you look at human history, we are tending towards less violence. So I read some kind of studies about, a few thousand years ago, what the chance of was of violent death, be it from war, be it from like violence, among neighbors, whatever it is. And like humanity has sort of been progressing towards higher levels of like integration and connection, and also, I guess, rule of law. And that has, moved us away from life being nasty, brutish, and short.
Mm.
And I wonder, I'm not so familiar with Sparta. I've spent a bit more time on the Vikings, and I know that, like, let's say the Vikings had this very, violence oriented religion, really, because for them to get to Valhalla, the best way to get there is to die in battle.
Mm-hmm.
And so what this belief system and like these practices do is they kind of create like a celebration of violence. And it might make sense perhaps at a time where the world is a more violent place. And then, my interpretation of that was that kind of, okay, then you have Christianity, then you have this kind of like more peaceful mindset that comes in, which turn the other cheek. And, these kind of belief systems that maybe move us towards more peace and less violence. And, you kind of reference Sparta a lot. And I wonder what you might have to say about that. Like, do you not think that if we resurrect maybe these kind of like, Spartan or Viking ethics, are we not kind of celebrating violence as opposed to moving society away from it?
We'd have to define our terms of violence. What would you define violence as?
I mean, I would define it as some kind of something that would result in death by, another human being's hand he has a weapon in his hand and I end up with my head smashed in. Like, I guess that would be like my absolute base definition of violence.
So the taking of something that is not yours from somebody who has it, that's a violent act. You're taking the life of somebody, or you're using violence to take over something that it's not necessarily yours, like another country, or you're taking the wife, or you're taking his booty, his whatever he's acquired, and you're doing a very curt, short act that he can't counter or she can't counter. So that could be called a violent. And the reason why I'm defining this is because the one thing that is missing in the analogy is we progressed out of a tribal society because we were all tribes, and then we had technological advances, and then we had more technological advances that allowed life to last a little longer because diseases got reduced, because the underpinning of all that simply was earn it, build something that's better than before. That earn it mentality started about 2000, maybe 2,500 years ago, that you weren't born bad. You could earn your way out of things. Even though you're disabled, which is the teaching of Christ, you can get up and move. Your sins don't define you. So that earn the next step of your life. So that earn it mentality is the definitive crossover between what you're thinking is violent and not violent. I suggest that there's still utter violence now that is subtle. So racism is the most violent minded thing you could ever put in front of somebody. It's very violent. It makes people do activity that they don't inherently do. That creates violence. Just the wording of that we are different is very violent. But earn your way, nothing violent about that. And that was what happened in the United States. We're going to earn we're going to start a new life here called we're going to govern ourselves. We're going to earn our spot in the world. And we made 100,000 mistakes doing it. We killed the Indians, got it. There's a lot of bad things that happen in everything that people do. But the one thing that you can't hear about, because it would overcome all this weird conversation of how violence is what one thing or the other, is you never hear earn it. You hear that you deserve it. That's the most violent minded thing you can ever tell your kid. is you deserve to be a winner. So I look at it entirely differently. I look at violence as an act that steals from somebody else, and it doesn't have to be a fist or a bullet. Eventually, that usually happens. Though, when people can't tolerate what's going on, they take up arms and they overcome the problem that's in front of them, because violence defines things immediately. I think everybody should know them. You should know what you're asking them to do. When you shut the border down, it's a very violent act. You're causing businesses to shut down. All that stuff, what I call violence. And just the fact that you have a gun doesn't make you a violent character. It makes you a player in the game. If you have a gun, now I'm a player. I will never have violence perpetrated to me, because I have the ability to enact violence back that puts me on the table of being a powerful human being. It's a weird way to look at it. And I know I went off track there, but that was a very complicated question you asked.
Mm-hmm. No, it was a complicated question. And, Thom, I really want to just thank you again for being willing to go on this adventure with us. Because I know, like, for me, having this exchange, and like, that's the beauty, or I know for me and Jonathan, of doing this podcast, is like, we don't want to only have easy conversations. We don't want to only talk to people who have the same opinions as we do, or the same life experiences, or the same perspective on things. And so, like, I want to really thank you for, taking the time to talk to us, and just being really authentic in your answers.
Sure. Thank you.
So I think we're going to wrap up the episode slowly. So unless you have anything else that you'd like to add.
Be brave. Like, everybody's listening, especially, mindfulness and wealth. The one conversation that doesn't come up well in that space is be brave in what you do. Like, stand your ground a little more as a leader, and especially with being mindful, is don't sway all the time. Sometimes it's better to be brave and hold your ground and let your mind be a little more solid than it is to be flexible. And the pursuit of wealth is a brave conversation to have. And I would want to leave it at that.
Thanks, Thom. Much appreciated.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yes. So thank you very much, Thom, for taking the time to talk with us today. And that's it.
Thank you all.